It was a Tuesday morning in early September, somewhere over the plains of Kansas, and the sky was that crystal-clear blue that pilots live for. Not a cloud anywhere, visibility for miles in every direction. Captain David Mitchell was 46 years old, had been flying commercial aircraft for 22 years, had logged over 15,000 hours in the cockpit, and he'd never once had an emergency that he couldn't handle with training and experience. He was flying a Boeing 737 from Dallas to Chicago, a routine 2-hour flight that he'd flown hundreds of times before, carrying 163 passengers and a crew of 6. David wasn't particularly religious, had grown up going to church with his family, but stopped going in his 20s when life got busy and faith seemed less relevant than career and success. He believed in God the way a lot of people do, abstractly, distantly, the kind of belief that doesn't really affect how you live your day-to-day life. He prayed occasionally, usually when his kids were sick or when his wife was worried about something, but it was more habit than conviction, more ritual than relationship. They were cruising at 31,000 feet, everything running smoothly. The first officer, Mark, handling the radio communications while David monitored the instruments. The passengers were settled in, some sleeping, some reading, some watching movies on their phones, all of them trusting that the 2 men in the cockpit knew exactly what they were doing. David was drinking coffee from a thermos, thinking about his daughter's soccer game that weekend when he felt it, a sharp, sudden pain in his chest, like someone had reached inside his ribcage and squeezed his heart with a fist. He gasped, dropped the thermos, and his left arm went numb, completely numb from shoulder to fingertips. "Oh no," he whispered, and Mark looked over at him. "Dave, you okay?" David tried to answer, but couldn't get enough air. The pain was spreading now, radiating up into his jaw and down his left side, and he knew exactly what this was, because his father had died of a massive heart attack at 52, and he'd always feared he'd inherited that genetic time bomb. "Mark, I think I'm having a heart attack," he managed to say, and Mark's eyes went wide. "What? Are you serious? Get on the radio, declare medical emergency. We need to land now." But even as he said it, David knew they were in trouble, because they were over central Kansas, at least 40 minutes from the nearest major airport, and he could feel himself getting weaker, his vision starting to tunnel. "By the way, before I keep going, drop a comment and let me know where you're listening to this story from." Mark grabbed the radio. "Kansas City Center, this is Delta 447, declaring emergency. Captain is having medical emergency. Need immediate clearance to nearest suitable airport." The air traffic controller's voice came back immediately, professional but concerned. "Delta 447, roger. Understand medical emergency. Nearest suitable is Wichita. Bearing 220, approximately 120 miles. Vectoring you now." Mark acknowledged and started the turn, but David was fading fast. The pain was so intense he couldn't focus, couldn't think, and his hands fell away from the controls. "Dave, stay with me," Mark was saying, but David felt like he was falling, felt like the cockpit was tilting even though he knew it wasn't. His heart was racing, stuttering, doing things it absolutely should not be doing, and then suddenly it wasn't racing anymore, it was slowing down, way down, and he thought, "This is it. I'm dying at 31,000 feet with 163 people depending on me." He tried to pray, tried to form words, but all that came out was, "God, help, please, the people, save the people," and then everything went black. Mark watched in horror as David slumped forward in his seat, unconscious, maybe dead, and he was now the only pilot on a commercial jet carrying over 160 passengers with an incapacitated captain and still 40 minutes from an emergency landing. He hit the call button for the lead flight attendant. "Jennifer, get up here now. We have an emergency." She was there in 30 seconds, saw David slumped over, and her face went pale. "Is he?" "I don't know. Check his pulse, see if he's breathing. I need to fly the plane." Jennifer checked, her hands shaking. He has a pulse. It's weak and irregular, but he's breathing. Okay, get him out of that seat. See if there's a doctor on board. Do whatever you can. I have to get us on the ground. Jennifer and another flight attendant managed to pull David out of the captain's seat and lay him in the narrow space behind the cockpit, and Jennifer went on the intercom. If there is a doctor or nurse on board, please identify yourself to a flight attendant immediately. 2 people came forward, a cardiologist from Houston and an ER nurse from Chicago, and they started working on David, doing what they could with the limited medical supplies in the emergency kit, but the prognosis wasn't good. He needed a hospital, needed it fast. Mark was flying the plane alone now, hands gripping the yoke, eyes scanning the instruments, trying to remember every bit of training about single-pilot operations, about handling emergencies, about not panicking when everything goes wrong. He'd been a first officer for 8 years, had thousands of hours of experience, but he'd never landed a 737 by himself with a full passenger load and a dying captain behind him. The radio crackled. Delta 447, Wichita approach. We have you on radar. Descend and maintain flight level 240. Expecting vectors for ILS runway 19 left. Emergency equipment will be standing by. Mark acknowledged and started the descent, but his hands were shaking, and he realized he was terrified, not just for himself, but for every single person on this plane who was trusting him to get them down safely. He glanced back at David, at the doctor doing chest compressions, at the nurse squeezing an oxygen bag, and he thought, please don't die. Please, God, don't let him die. We need him. I need him. And then something happened that Mark couldn't explain, wouldn't be able to explain even years later when he told this story over and over. The yoke in his hands, the control column that steers the aircraft, moved on its own, not a lot, but enough that Mark noticed. A gentle correction to the left, smoothing out a slight deviation he hadn't even realized he was making. He looked at the autopilot panel, but autopilot was off. He'd disengaged it when David collapsed, so he'd have full manual control. The yoke shouldn't be moving by itself. That's not how planes work, but it had. And now the aircraft was perfectly on course, perfectly trimmed, flying smoother than Mark had been flying it himself. "What the?" Mark whispered, and then it happened again. The throttles adjusted themselves, pulling back slightly, managing the descent rate perfectly, better than Mark would have done. He looked at his hands on the controls, and he could feel it, a presence, like someone else was in the cockpit with him. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing, someone who was flying this plane with him, or maybe for him. The voice came, not out loud, but in his head, clear and calm and unmistakable. "I've got this, Mark. Just follow my lead. I won't let them fall." Mark's breath caught. Who are you? You know who I am. You've heard about me your whole life. You just never thought I'd show up like this." "Jesus." "Yes, now focus. We're going to land this plane together, you and me, and everyone on board is going to walk away." Mark felt tears starting. "But I don't know if I can do this. I've never landed alone. I'm not qualified for this." "You're not alone. I'm right here, and Mark, I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" Mark nodded, even though he felt insane, even though he knew he was probably having a stress-induced hallucination. But the controls were still moving with a precision he couldn't achieve on his own, and the plane was descending perfectly, and he didn't have any better options. Okay, I trust you." The descent continued, the plane cutting through the sky like it was on rails, every adjustment perfect, every heading change smooth. And Mark found that he wasn't fighting the controls anymore. He was just guiding them, just being the hands, while something or someone else provided the skill. They broke through 15,000 feet, then 10,000, and Wichita appeared on the horizon, the airport laid out below them like a model. "Delta 447, you're cleared for ILS approach runway 19 left. Winds 210 at 8 knots, visibility 10 miles, emergency equipment in position." Mark acknowledged, his voice steadier now, and he felt the yoke move again, lining up perfectly with the approach path. The glide slope indicator centered, the localizer locked on. They crossed the outer marker at exactly the right altitude and speed, and Mark realized he wasn't even looking at the instruments anymore. He was just feeling it, feeling the plane respond to inputs that weren't entirely his own. The landing gear came down, the flaps extended, and the 737 settled into the approach like a bird coming home to roost. "You're doing great, Mark. Just a little more. Keep your hands light on the controls. Let me handle the fine adjustments." And Mark did. He relaxed his grip, stopped trying to force anything, and just let it happen. They crossed the threshold at exactly the right height. The wheels touched down so gently that half the passengers didn't even realize they'd landed, and Mark applied the brakes smoothly, brought the plane to a stop on the runway, and sat there shaking, unable to believe what had just happened. The voice came one more time. "See? I told you I had this. Now go take care of your captain. He's going to make it. The paramedics will stabilize him. But Mark, I need you to do something for me. Anything. When people ask how you landed this plane by yourself, tell them the truth. Tell them you didn't do it alone. Tell them I was here because there are people who need to know that I still show up, that I still intervene, that I still care about the details of their lives. I'll tell them, I promise." "Good, now take a breath, you did well." And then the presence was gone. The cockpit felt normal again, and Mark sat there crying while emergency vehicles surrounded the plane. The paramedics rushed on board, got David on a stretcher, had him in an ambulance within 3 minutes. The cardiologist who'd been working on him told Mark later that David had been clinically dead for almost 2 minutes. His heart had stopped completely, but they'd gotten it started again. And somehow, miraculously, there didn't appear to be any brain damage. David spent a week in the hospital, had surgery to put in 3 stents, and made a full recovery. The passengers deplaned, shaken but grateful, many of them having no idea how close they'd come to disaster, how a first officer with no captain and a medical emergency at 31,000 feet should have ended very differently. The NTSB launched an investigation, pulled the flight data recorder, listened to the cockpit voice recorder, and what they found made no sense. The data showed piloting that was textbook perfect, every input precisely timed, every adjustment exactly what it should have been, the kind of flying that even the most experienced captains would struggle to achieve under normal circumstances, let alone in an emergency with a single pilot. The lead investigator called Mark in for an interview. "Mr. Patterson, I've been doing this for 26 years. I've investigated hundreds of incidents, and I can tell you that what you did up there is extraordinary. The flying on that recorder is some of the best I've ever seen, and I need to know, how did you do it?" Mark looked at him, at the skeptical professional face, and he thought about lying, about taking the credit, about saying it was just training and experience, but he'd made a promise, and he wasn't going to break it. "I didn't do it alone," Mark said. "What do you mean?" "I mean I had help. I mean the controls were moving on their own, making corrections I couldn't have made, and there was a voice, a presence, and I know how this sounds. I know you're going to think I'm crazy. But it was Jesus. He was in that cockpit with me. He flew that plane with me, and that's the only reason we're alive." The investigator stared at him for a long moment. "Mr. Patterson, are you seriously telling me that you believe Jesus Christ co-piloted your aircraft? I'm not telling you I believe it. I'm telling you it happened, I felt it, I heard him, and you can look at that data all day long, and you won't find a rational explanation for how a first officer with my level of experience flew that perfectly under those circumstances." The investigator closed his folder. "Well, I can't put that in my report, but off the record, I've seen things in this job that I can't explain, and maybe, just maybe, you're telling the truth." The story went viral. First officer lands plane in miracle emergency. And Mark did interview after interview, and every single time he told the exact same story, never wavering, never backing down, and some people believed him, and some people didn't. Aviation experts weighed in, saying it was impossible, saying the stress had caused him to hallucinate, saying there must be a logical explanation, but nobody could provide one that fit the data. David Mitchell, the captain, recovered fully and came to visit Mark a month after the incident. They sat in Mark's living room and David said, "I need to know what happened up there after I went down." So Mark told him every detail, and when he finished, David was quiet for a long time. "I prayed," David finally said. "Right before I lost consciousness, I prayed. First time I'd really prayed in probably 20 years, and I asked God to save the people on that plane. I didn't even think about asking him to save me. I just didn't want all those people to die because of my heart." Mark nodded. "He heard you, Dave. He heard you, and he answered, and he didn't just save them, he saved you too." David wiped his eyes. "I've been going to church again, taking my family, and my kids asked me why we stopped going in the first place, and I didn't have a good answer. I just knew that I'd been given another chance, and I wasn't going to waste it." The airline brought Mark in for a debriefing, and the chief pilot, a no-nonsense woman named Sarah, who'd been flying for 30 years, sat across from him. "Mark, I've read the reports, I've listened to the audio, I've talked to the investigators, and I want to hear it from you, what really happened up there." Mark took a breath. "Captain, I know how this is going to sound, but I'm going to tell you anyway because I promised I would. Jesus was in that cockpit with me. He helped me fly that plane. He made inputs I couldn't have made, and he's the reason 163 people went home to their families that night." Sarah studied him for a moment. "You know that if you stick to that story, some people are going to question your fitness to fly." "Yes, ma'am, I know." "And you're willing to risk your career to tell people that?" "I am, because it's the truth, and because he asked me to." Sarah leaned back. "Well, for what it's worth, I believe you, not because I can prove it, but because I've been flying long enough to know that sometimes things happen up there that can't be explained, and maybe we've been too quick to dismiss the possibility that God still intervenes in the world." She paused. "You're cleared to return to flight status, and Mark, thank you for bringing them home." Mark flew for another 15 years before retiring, and in that time he became known in the aviation community as the pilot who had help from above, and some people said it with respect, and some said it mockingly, but Mark didn't care because he knew what had happened. He spoke at churches and conferences, always telling the same story, always pointing people back to the moment when he felt those controls move in his hands and heard that voice in his head. David Mitchell became a close friend, and they would sometimes fly together, and passengers who knew the story would ask them about it, and they'd both tell their parts. David about the prayer, Mark about the presence, and some flights they'd have people crying in their seats, people coming forward to talk to them after landing, people saying that hearing the story had changed something in them, had made God real in a way he hadn't been before. Today, 5 years after Mark's retirement, he and David still tell the story, and aviation schools use the incident as a case study in emergency management, even though they can't officially acknowledge the supernatural element. The flight data recorder from that day is stored at the NTSB headquarters, and engineers who've studied it have admitted privately that the flying was too perfect, that the timing of inputs was too precise, that something beyond human capability was at work. Mark keeps a copy of the cockpit voice recording, and sometimes late at night he'll listen to it, and he can hear himself in those moments, hear the fear in his voice, and then hear the calmness that came over him when he stopped trying to do it alone. And there's one moment, right at the beginning of the final approach, where if you listen very carefully with the volume turned all the way up, you can hear something, a whisper almost, a voice that doesn't belong to Mark or David or anyone on the radio, saying just 3 words. "I've got you. And if you're listening to this story right now, and you're in a situation where you feel like you're falling, where you feel like you're 30,000 feet up with no way down, where you feel like you're the only one in control, and you know you can't handle it alone, I need you to hear what Mark learned that day. You're not alone. You've never been alone. Jesus is right there with you. And if you'll just loosen your grip, if you'll just stop trying to do everything yourself, if you'll just say out loud, I need help, I can't do this alone, He will step in. He will take control. He will fly the plane when you can't, because that's who He is. That's what He does. He's the God who shows up in emergencies, who takes control when we've lost it, who lands planes that should crash, who saves lives that should be lost. Don't wait until you're in free fall to call out to Him. Call out today. Tell Him you need Him, and watch what He does, because He's still in the business of doing impossible things.